Hey there, this is Introduction to Graphic Design, and it's our fourth session, and we're talking about designing with images. I'm Alvalin Lundgren. So one of the obvious things that we can start out with is the idea that your camera is a design tool. It's not just a means of taking selfies or recording what's around you. You can actually use it in your design process for a variety of things. You can record your work in progress so that you can look back on various stages of your design development and rethink or explain or give your work more authenticity and you as a designer more authority by being able to show your work. It helps you communicate your process and it helps you authenticate your work as being original and belonging to you. Use your camera to capture inspiration. Inspiration's all around you, and usually it's not until you're actually working on a project that you're going to be able to recognize inspiration sources for that particular project. But if you make it a habit of taking pictures of interesting things that catch your eye, and then curating those things in, say, a Pinterest page or in a swipe file, you are never going to be without ideas. Especially with the right apps, one really good thing that your camera is good for is to capture color and color schemes. For drawing and illustration, your camera is an excellent tool for capturing moments, gestures, facial expressions, movement, groupings of figures, people's faces that you can draw from later on. And in the same way, you can also capture textures that catch your eye. And then you can make brushes out of them for Photoshop or Illustrator, or use them as backgrounds and certain visual effects in Photoshop. Using your own images gives you the ability to bypass having to look for stock images all the time, which is something that, although it can be budget conscious, it's not necessarily time conscious. It takes a lot of time to search for just the right stock image. Quite often, you'll be able to capture an image yourself that you can use in your work. And if you're an illustrator, using the camera to capture direct inspiration for current and future work is huge. Because of social media, photo identity for a brand, for a business, even for yourself, is necessary. Photo identities are as distinct as brand identities are, and they help differentiate, and they help communicate, and they help establish reputation. Capturing imagery and even manipulating it right there on the phone via an app will help build social proof and brand. So I've got a couple recommendations for you. There are two things that graphic designers should get good at. One of them is drawing, and the reason you want to get good at drawing is to be able to quickly communicate ideas, and drawing builds your observational skill. So you don't have to be a Michelangelo or a Drew Struzan when it comes to drawing, but you should be able to draw well enough that you can capture your thoughts and communicate ideas to others. The other thing is photography. Everybody takes photographs, so graphic designers should take good photographs. So understanding the basics of photography, and I'm not talking about just with your camera phone, I'm talking about getting to understand the basics of creating and capturing photographic images. I'm talking about understanding f-stops and shutter speed and RAW versus JPEG. A good basic knowledge of photography is a good idea for any graphic designer. And both drawing and photography skills can augment your design skills professionally to help you earn extra income and just expand your skill set and your ability to serve your clients. So now that we've talked about what you can do to create and capture images, let's talk about how to use images. Why are images so important to graphic design? Well, first of all, we human beings are naturally drawn to visuals. We're naturally drawn to images. We see visually. We constantly have an image in front of us, our visual field. So it's only natural that we would be attracted to images. And images are hooks. The right photo or the right illustration in the right setting, in the right graphic environment will draw people in. They will engage them, they will attract their attention, and they'll cause them to get curious and want to know more. Brands create photographic identities. That's a visual look and feel that they use on social media and their own websites, in their brochures. So there is a consistency between anything that's print and direct marketing versus social marketing. So imagery being all around us is something that brands use to help build their reputation, grow their audience, and increase their revenue. Images are visual language. You can say a lot more in an image than you can with words. In most cases, that's true. You can show somebody a picture and communicate much more quickly, clearly, and easily than you can with a 500-word description. Images add color, they add interest, they add texture, pattern, and rhythm to designs. So they play a variety of roles. They also enhance or support textual content. This specifically pertains to illustration. Illustration is an art form that merges graphic design with fine art, but illustration originally and still does enhance textual content. One thing to understand about images, especially photographs, is that they are moments in time. A photograph captures a moment. Prior to that capture, things were happening, and following that capture, afterward, things continued to happen. And if you string enough still photos together, you end up with motion graphics, film, or video. Another thing about images is you can use them as visual metaphors. In other words, you can compare and contrast ideas and things visually. A photograph is basically an image that has been captured using a device, a camera. The image is caught with light and focused onto film or a sensor. Most of the time these days, that image is stored and transferred digitally, so it doesn't actually physically exist, but you could print it out and it becomes a physical piece. And then traditionally, with things like the collodion process and the cyanotype process and the gelatin silver print process, the image is made visible and also permanent on the paper through a chemical process. So we talk about capturing photographs because we don't really create the image. We also capture photographs in terms of screen captures on our desktop phones or tablets. So here's a photograph capturing a moment in time. Illustration doesn't capture, it can depict moments in time, but it doesn't capture them. But illustration is specifically created in any kind of media for storytelling or communication purposes. Illustration opens up a wide variety of stylistic possibilities. Every illustrator has their own distinct style. And when you are looking for a particular style of illustration, you're not going to go looking for certain illustrators who don't do that style. There is a blend of illustration and photography known as photo illustration, which involves compositing a variety of captured images. Illustration can be narrative, in other words, storytelling, or presenting a moment in time, or presenting a sequence of moment in times. It can be conceptual, where it is conveying an idea. It can be used in advertising. Editorial illustration is anything having to do with publications and book design, and even institutional things like annual reports. Spot illustrations enhance portions of textual content on a page. Looking at this painting by Nancy Glazier called Primary Colors, these three horses are not directly represented, but there's enough realism in them that the application of the saturated primary colors becomes quite plausible. Another term that'll come in useful for you is the composite. So basically, it's based off the idea of composing. A composite is a single image that's made by combining a variety of elements. A composite is also a preliminary illustration or idea created from using a variety of source material. Illustrators present a comp, which is a rougher stage for approval before beginning to work on the finished artwork. Photo composites are in wide use, as well as photo illustration. So this is a piece of photography for advertising. And this is made up of many photos. At first glance, we can say, well, there's the headphones, and then we have the paint, and then we have the background. So maybe it's two different photos. There's actually about 40 different layers in this original file. And a lot of those layers are on the headphones. So the headphone layer itself is not just a single layer, it is many layers that are working together. The blue paint is on its own layer, and the red paint is another layer, and there's other things going on in the background. Both shots of the paint were white when they were shot, so the color has been added in what's called the post-processing or the image editing. So a lot of commercial photography, especially if it's product or it's liquids or it's showing some sort of motion, is actually a composite of a variety of different shots ported into Photoshop on various layers. So let's look at how photos can be used. This is a very elegant destination ad, and it is a composite. You can kind of see the lighting on the couple is different than the lighting in the background. We have at least this photo. The sky's probably a different photo. The water might be a different photo, and then the marsh area back there. But notice how the photo becomes the device on which the text sits. And so we have the headline here with this really nice hand-drawn script. Then we have the body copy, and we have the logo. And it's very quiet. The colors work really well together. The couple comes forward with light and shadow. They stand out from the background. And we just have this really nice, calm, elegant feel to the whole thing. The image itself is a full bleed. This could be a poster. It could be an email blast. It could be a printed page in a magazine. Another style of illustration used for a concert series put on by Conan O'Brien. This one features Pitbull. It's a limited color palette. There's an orange and there's a red and there's blue. And you can see that the whole thing is actually an illustration, and it's a digital illustration composited of a variety of elements, including the typography. Illustrations often used commercially, especially in packaging design. We can see variations that are very similar to each other. This is actually deployed on the package itself. So just taking the little spot illustration and putting it right there, framed very nicely by the title block. This is obviously a photo illustration that's been composited, very similar to the Beats photo. So we have the various peels. They were photographed separately. We have the elderflower down here, the splashes, the label, the bottle, and then the background. So photography can be used. It's not just capturing an image. It's capturing, it's compositing, it's composition, it's multi-layered. Photography and imaging has come a long way, and it can be used in some very exciting ways. This is a book cover. The whole thing is hand done. So we have even the lettering, the title, the layout, the illustration. This is a type of narrative illustration. Kind of makes you want to open the book and start reading. This is another editorial illustration. It's a little more almost infographic idea. It's explaining various characters in a story, and they're looking like they're having a conversation. It's kind of an interesting little grouping here. Very stylized, using an outline and color fill. There seems to be a shadow cast over the tops of everyone. And then the light is kind of hitting the lower extremities. It's a very engaging illustration simply because of the gesture, the movement, and the fact that all the figures are kind of facing toward the center. This is kind of the focal point of the illustration and of the entire page, is what's going on here. So you can use photographs and illustrations in pretty much anything. Just be sure that you're using the right style of illustration and the right type of photography for the right reasons. So now let's take a look at various effects that you can do with images. And one of them is cropping. So this is a piece out of McCall's magazine quite a number of years ago. But it's classic editorial design by Otto Storch, and he used Marlene Dietrich's image, full figure, in the eye. Back then, that was quite an innovative idea. Otto Storch was known for his editorial layout design combining image and typography. You can use photographs to add color and use color in interesting ways. The yellow of the man's jacket is echoed by the yellow highlights over here. Very intriguing photo, interesting cropping. Gradients are really on trend, and they're made very popular by Spotify right now. The idea of not just gradients, but duotone, where you basically have two different hues, two different colors going on in an image, or else there's a gradation of color from one side to another. You can use images to frame text and vice versa. Look how effective this print ad is, simply because the type seems to move in and out of, it pushes and pulls into the smoke. It makes for a very compelling visual, and the ad that we're seeing here is asking a very compelling question. Flat lay, spreading things out and shooting from above at an angle or straight down. Made popular by Instagram, Pinterest, and Etsy. With flat lay, you can combine a variety of things, and they end up telling a story and how you combine them and what you're combining. So where do you find images to use other than creating them yourself? Photographers, illustrators, people who do information graphics, people who specialize in map making. Whatever your need, there's somebody out there who can create it. If you need a portrait shot, go to a portrait photographer. If you need fashion, go to a fashion photographer. Go to a sports photographer. If you need sports-related imagery, go to a product photographer who specializes in whatever product you're dealing with. There's a variety of sources that you can go to for photographers. With illustration, you're going to want to match the illustration style to the tone and the voice of the textual content. An illustration used in a magazine for kids is going to be very different in visual style, in look and feel, than an illustration that's used in American Lawyer Monthly. Illustrators will specialize in particular styles. Photographers will specialize in particular styles or subject matter. So talent is one of the places you can go, and probably should be the most obvious place you can go for images. And when you hire somebody to create images bespoke or custom, nobody else is going to be using those images. So that's another thing to think about. That's another reason for not using stock photography, because you'll have one brand using a photo and then another brand using the same photo, maybe with a little tweak and maybe not. So stock photography is not exclusively licensed. So speaking of stock, there's a variety of stock sources for illustration, for infographics, for photography. Usually stock images will have comps or lower res options that you can use in comping up a page or doing a preliminary layout for approval before purchasing the actual images. And those lower resolution images will have some sort of watermark. So stock sources, you basically purchase a license to the image. Rights managed images are going to cost more, and you buy a specific right to use an image for a specific thing. So multiple uses means the license fee goes up because you are buying more than one license to use that image. So if you buy an image that is rights managed, and you want to use it in a print ad, that's a different use than using it on a website. So you would end up paying for two uses for that single image. Royalty-free means you buy a license to use the image as often as you want, as long as you do it within certain parameters. So every time you buy a stock image, it comes with a license that gives you permission to use that image for certain things, but denies you permission to use it for others. There are free sources where you can find stock images. One of them is Wiki Commons. Another is Flickr Commons. Anything licensed under a Creative Commons license will have some restrictions, but you can pretty much use the image for a variety of things. Certain museums and galleries, like the National Gallery of Art, has an archive that they just made public, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a public archive. Getty has a public archive. Unsplash is a stock site. All the images on Unsplash are free. The idea is that you credit the photographer. It's not required, but it's a nice thing to do when you're able to do it. Pixabay is similar. It has no photographer credit requirement. And then Burst is a subsidiary of Shopify. They provide a variety of free images. All of these are good sources for free images. And of course, to license images, whether they're rights managed or royalty free, Getty Images, Shutterstock, iStock, Death to Stock, which used to be free, but now you have to pay a membership. There are other sources as well. And if the budget doesn't allow for custom work, and maybe it doesn't allow for stock licenses, maybe you can shoot it yourself or create it yourself. When you're dealing with images, you need to understand that they are intellectual property. So intellectual property is basically creative property or the result of a creative process of some sort. So writers, their intellectual property are the things that they write. Artists, their intellectual property are the things that they create. They paint or draw or shoot. Some things are protected under copyright law, meaning that the person who owns the copyright, usually the creator, needs to give permission for you to be able to use it. You should also be aware of copyright protection for your own work because you are creating work. Creative Commons is an open source. It allows free use and widespread use of intellectual property with certain limitations. Copyright infringement is a big issue. As a designer, especially if you are an independent designer or an independent illustrator or photographer, you're going to make your living by selling usage rights or the rights to use your images in various things. And what you don't want to have happen is that your work, your copyright, your right to use and copy and make derivative works and control how your work is used is infringed. The purchasing of usage rights is done through licensing, where the author gives permission, the licensor gives the permission to the licensee to use the work. So when you start dealing with images and intellectual property, you're going to need to be aware of all of these authorship and permission issues. You're working on a design, you need an image. Should you go with illustration or should you go with photography? Well, let's break that down a little bit. It depends upon your purpose for the design. If it's an article in a magazine that's talking about a particular person, maybe a photograph is the way to go. But maybe an illustrated portrait might serve the purpose as well, or even better, and it might be more interesting. So let's look at situations where you'd want to use illustration instead of photography, and then we'll look at using photography instead of illustration. So if you want to communicate a really complex idea, illustration's the way to go. Or if it's an abstract concept, illustration would also be the way to go. If it's something that's fantastic, or imaginative, illustration. If you want something that looks retro, absolutely illustration is the way to go. Sometimes illustration is the only thing that's going to fit the brand personality. Illustration, because of how style works, and style varies from artist to artist, illustrator to illustrator, you can differentiate a brand, a business, or a product or service from the competition very easily just by having a illustration identity instead of a photo identity. Illustration is very useful to create a mood, to visualize data like in infographics. Style or effect, you're looking for a particular type of illustration, something maybe very flat graphic or something that's highly realistic. If you want a custom image on a limited budget, illustrators are usually going to be less expensive than a photographer. A photographer is going to come with equipment, and there's a lot of post work with photography, so sometimes illustration is simpler and easier on the budget. So photography is useful and preferred over illustration if there's a specific product. If it's a specific person, you may want to use photography. Where you want realism or even hyperrealism, photography is really the only way to go. Same thing with accuracy. If you want a corporate or business-oriented look and feel, if you want to involve the viewer in the image or the overall design, photography is the way to go because it is more real than illustration, and when the budget allows. If you have the budget for bespoke photography, go for it. It's always better to shoot your own images or commission custom images than it is to go with stock. In any case, consider your purpose, consider the brand identity, consider the brand reputation, consider the mission and vision of the brand. Use the type of imagery, whether it's photos or illustrations, that are going to best fit your purpose. So let's talk a bit about framing, because framing is an art, and done well, it creates serious impact visually. Done poorly, it's the worst thing ever. So framing is highlighting information by surrounding it with things that point to that information. So this is just a blog image, a featured image on a blog that I created for a client. And he's talking about storytelling and persuasion in sales. And so I took the literal image of a frame and framed it with type on either side. And then I framed the type with the frame. And I framed this type between the black picture frame and the frame of reference, or the edges of the design. Framing is the idea that type, image, and graphic elements can be used to call attention to each other. So let's see how that works with this Adweek cover. First of all, his hand is gesturing forward toward the type. He's obviously looking out at you, so there's a lot of psychological connection between him in the image and you, the viewer. But the type is being framed by the hand, and actually by the face and the tie, and by the light side of the arm on the jacket over here. His face is being framed by the masthead. This block of type is being framed by the negative space around it and by the edge of the magazine, the edge of the design itself. The masthead is being framed by the margin. So again, there's several different instances of framing in this design, and it makes for a very effective design. At its most basic, framing is all about margins and bleeds and how the images and the type work with the entire design space. So here we have the same design space, height and width in terms of measurement, and the same photo is used in a variety of ways. It's framed differently. So here we have margin all around. It creates kind of a static idea, but it definitely calls a lot of attention to the image. Here, the image bleeds to the edge of the frame. We have a focus kind of on this area right here. She's popping out red, so that's coming forward, catching our eye. But we're looking at this conversation right in here because it's framed by everything around it. A partial bleed is where an image bleeds off on 1, 2, or 3 sides, but not all 4 sides of the design as we see here. Here there is no bleed. The photo is contained entirely within the perimeter or the frame of reference of the design. So what's happening here is that the photo is framed by the edge, the top edge, the side edge, and the white block below it. On this book cover, there's a lot of framing going on. First of all, we have the alligator type floating in the yellow field. The perimeter of that yellow is framing the alligator. Then we have this type and part of the zebra framed within the white area. And then we have the logo framed within the blue-green area. The top color area and the bottom color area frame the white area where the most important information is. We use framing to increase the visibility of elements in the design. Here, the design space is split vertically between the black and white photograph and the yellow sidebar. If we were to put all this type here, it would compete with the background and the background would compete with it. Placing all the type on the yellow ground separates it from this, actually calls attention to this. Notice how the cityscape is framed by the sky and the water. Notice how New is framed horizontally, and then York is framed horizontally. 40th anniversary issue is framed between the masthead and the top edge of the design. Each one of these block of texts is framed within rules or lines, and those rules bring order, they separate everything, and they help bring focal points to all of these headlines. We use framing to transition from foreground to middle ground to background plane. So here in this 2-page spread, we have a title bar which is overlapping the currency, which is sitting on top of the background. The type here is framed in the black area, as is this. The currency is framed on the white. The type here is framed vertically between the top edge of the design and the top of the currency. It's framed horizontally between this black notch and this white notch. The vertical black bar is framed from here and this. It's not framed at the top or bottom, it bleeds. And the currency is framed again all the way around by the white ground. We use framing to influence how people will interpret the content on the page. So first of all, we're connecting all of this with its ample amount of negative space with this, which is a little denser. This is a photographic image. A lot of movement in here. We got a strong sense of diagonal coming in. We have these curves. We have this curve. This pulley is being framed by the text block and this text block. This text block is being framed by the pulley and the gutter. So this is a left-hand page, a right-hand page on a two-page spread. That place in the middle where everything is bound together is called the gutter. And so this block of text, the caption, is framed between the ropes, the lines on the pulley, and the gutter. This entire block is framed between the pulley and the right edge of the design. Each word is framed on its own white color bar. And then the author's name is framed on the gray. So again, there's a lot going on. We use framing to create a focal point. His face is being framed by the masthead. We cannot help but look here first. Framing can be open or closed. Where the title is framed in the teeth, which is actually the buildings, we see that it is not fully surrounded. There are pathways. Closed looks like this. The text is framed inside a very closed, it goes all the way out to the edge. So there's no opening, there's no gaps in that framing device. Notice that there is a thin line that frames the entire page, and that is closed. Cropping is another way that we use framing, and cropping is simply cutting things off. It's kind of like pruning an image. So this photo has been cropped in such a way that the darkness of the shirts sets the stage to position the type. This is cropped a lot closer. The cropping frames the portrait. This is a partial bleed. The design extends beyond the ends of the photograph. The red bar is framing the white type it contains. There's an importance to this because he's looking this direction toward it. Here's a general rule of thumb. Inside every photo, there are other photos. So you can take a larger photo and crop it in an interesting way, and you have brand new photos. The concept of frame and frame is that there are repeated framing devices within an image or an illustration that frame other elements within the image or illustration. So as we're looking at this, the first frame we apprehend is the frame of reference, which is the entire design space. It's the edges of the design, and that's a horizontal rectangle. We have a smaller rectangle here, so that's one frame. Then we have this doorway, which is another frame, framing this doorway, which is another frame, framing this window. Here's another frame-in-frame concept, and this time it's a broken frame. So the triangular areas on either side frame the type. The white area frames the figure in the chair and also the type. The red chair frames the figure. The humble sidebar ad uses frame and frame. So we have the top red bar and the bottom red bar, and they are framing the main content. There is a side area on both sides where there is some pattern. We have repeated elements, a little bit of breaking of the edge for interest. The side elements frame the white space, which frames the type and the product. The price is framed by the white space. This title is framed by the white space. The call to action button is framed by the red.